Okay, you're on.
Well, a couple of introductory comments. First, it's always interesting when I take a look at these after I've cut and paste and put the outlines together to see that something from a previous outline got sneaked into our outline tonight. In part one, we're going to look at chapter 24. We've already studied the Feast of Booths, and we're going to look at the next chapter that follows chapter 23 about the 7 redemptive feasts. The second introductory comment is that if you've ever taken, I don't know how many of you got a chance to look at chapter 24, but when you look at chapter 24, it looks like it's kind of a hodgepodge of topics. You're not quite sure why it's thrown in there, because what happens after the chapter 24 is the instructions that God gives just before the Israelites depart from Sinai and start their journey through the wilderness towards the promised land. And there's instructions from God about what to do when they reach the promised land and some other things to finish up the book of Leviticus. And what we just got through with the Feast of Redemption, and then we have this chapter thrown in there. And so one of the challenges that took a little bit more time for preparation is to try and glean out of chapter 24 the common theme, if you will, and the importance or why God chose to put this chapter where he did and say in the chapter what he did. So when we look at this chapter, the main theme that I want you, or the main idea that topic wise that I want you to get out of chapter 24 is the word sanctity. Now, sanctity is holiness of character or holiness in fact. And so when we uphold the sanctity of something, we're upholding the holiness or the setting apart of. And this chapter, as I studied it, the thought about sanctity came out more and more clear to me. Now, last week we did conclude the chapter 23 and our study of the 7 redemptive feasts, and concluded with talking about the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tabernacles, which really looked forward to and anticipated the future reign of the Messiah as king over all the nations and to the complete restoration of Israel. To Israel, having rejected Christ, and this Feast of Tabernacles, with not fully understanding that it was talking about Christ, looked at the end of times when the Messiah would come and reign on earth as king over Israel and all the nations, and Israel would be restored to the promised land and be preeminent among all the nations. They kept on, the Old Testament's filled with Israel's prophecies and prayers for the coming of the Messiah. And to the Israelites, the coming of the Messiah at the end times is the first coming of the Messiah. But to the Christians, they look forward to Jesus returning to earth as a Messiah to commence his earthly reign in the millennium. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to continue with the book of Leviticus, focusing on chapter 24. When I looked at this chapter, the placement of the chapter puzzled me, as well as the 3 parts of this chapter. So as we go through the lesson, we're going to look at the 3 parts, and the common theme will be the theme of sanctity. It really is, after these redemptive feasts, pointing towards the future, God slapping Israel on the head and reminding them, you are a holy people that I've already redeemed from Egypt to be my holy people. And there's certain things that are very important to keep in mind. So the main message I want you to get from tonight's lesson is that the verses in chapter 24, the book of Leviticus, remind us that the relationship between God and man was designed to be a holy relationship, requiring mankind to maintain the sanctity of the relationship on a daily basis. To then, we'll talk about what the Israelites did to maintain that. But today, that's by prayer, study, and worship. To recognize and honor the holiness of God and God's name, and to exercise and dispense justice by incorporating God's holiness in our laws. So the common theme is sanctity. The outline is we're going to talk about maintaining the sanctity of the covenant relationship. The second part, maintaining the sanctity of God's holy name. And 3, maintaining the sanctity of life. Then we'll have 2 really good discussion questions that Paul is really going to enjoy. And we'll end up with some conclusions. Well, let's start with the first part of chapter 24, and that's maintaining the sanctity of the covenant relationship. The first 8 verses of the Leviticus in chapter 24 focus on the oil for the lampstand and the bread used for the showbread placed on the golden table in the inner court of the tabernacle. Now, we've studied this before, but I'm going to remind you of some of these things to put it in perspective to what God is adding. And the inner court, or the holy place, was where the priests made offerings to God on the altar of incense. They entered the holy place 2 times each day, morning and evening, and they brought with them fire from the brazen altar to burn incense on the golden altar. And so if you remember, the golden altar was right before the veil. The veil separated the holy place from the most holy place, which contained the Ark of the Covenant. And so this veil separated, and right before the veil is this golden altar. Each of the 3 furnishings in the inner court depicted Christ in his present glorified position, acting on behalf of those chosen by God in order to sustain them until Christ returns from heaven to establish his kingdom on earth. So when we looked at the inner court, there were 3 different pieces of furniture in the inner court, or the holy place. There was the golden altar, the lampstand, and the showbread table. And we're going to talk about 2 of those furnishings tonight. The table of showbread presented Christ and his ongoing preservation of the nation of Israel during the age of the Gentiles. So it foretold that Christ would be there preserving them during the age of the Gentiles. The lampstand and its 7 candles depicted the blessings and gifts which Christ gives to his church through the Holy Spirit, who was sent by Jesus after he was ascended to heaven. The 7 spirits of the Holy Spirit, the 7 candles on the lampstand. Now, the golden altar of incense depicted Christ in his glorified position as our high priest, continually bringing our praise, worship, prayers, and petitions before God in order to sustain the church until Christ is once again reunified with his church. So just like the burning incense was every day, twice a day, filled and burned, lifting up the fumes of the incense, which was an aroma pleasing to God, it really represented the petitions and prayers of the Israelites, foretelling the role that Christ has as our high priest. Now, one of the 2 items we're going to talk about is a golden lampstand. Now, a lot of scripture refers to the lampstand as a candlestick. Well, it's not really a candlestick. The lampstand comes from the Hebrew word menorah, which also translates light bearer. The term lampstand is more appropriate than candlestick because the lampstand had 6 lamps fueled by oil fed from calyxes at the base of each of 3 sets of branches. So you have a basic tree-like or trunk with 3 sets of branches coming out the sides, and at the very top you had another lamp. So there are a total of 7 lamps that were part of this lampstand. The lampstand, its branches, and all of its ornamentation was made of a talent, or 75 pounds of solid gold. It was all beat into shape. And if you look at the depiction of when the Romans destroyed the temple and took this lampstand and carried it back to Rome, and it's on the Ark of Titus in Rome, this thing was a huge lampstand, 75 pounds, worth in today's value about $2 million. The component parts of the lampstand consisted of 1 solid piece. It had 2 components consisting of the stand itself, or the trunk, and then the 6 branches with the extension at the top. The 3 branches extended from each side of the lampstand. Each branch was topped with a candle. In addition, 1 lamp extended from the top of the lampstand. So there's, again, a total of 7 lamps. The purpose and significance of the lampstand. The solid pure gold lampstand signified Christ in his risen, glorified position. The lampstand stood in the south side of the holy place, which if you're entering into the holy place, it would be on your left side, the south side. The lamps fueled by oil were continually kept lit while the tabernacle was set up, and it provided the light for the inner court. So this lampstand burned 24 hours a day, and it was lit by olive oil that was poured into little calyxes or bowls at the base of these branches that fed up and provided oil to the light. Now we're going to go into the book of Leviticus and the verses that we're studying tonight. Verses 1 through 4 of Leviticus chapter 24 describe the oil used to fuel the 7 lamps on the lampstand. The verses say, the Lord spoke to Moses, command the Israelites to bring you pure oil from crushed olives for the light, in order to keep the lamp burning continually. Aaron is to tend it continually, from evening until morning before the Lord outside the veil of the testimony in the tent of meeting. This is a permanent statute throughout your generations. He must continually tend the lamps on the pure gold lampstand in the Lord's presence. Notice that in this short 4 verses, the word continually is repeated 3 times. Now let's talk about the olive oil. The olive oil was to be both pure and clear. It wasn't supposed to be mixed with any spices. The normal way that you produce olive oil, the economical way, is to press it. But what they did to make this oil for the Lord's lampstand was gently pounding the olives in a mortar and extracting the oil from the olives. This way produces a less contaminated, more pure oil. And if you want to really buy a very expensive olive oil, you're going to get one that doesn't say pressed, but it's going to be made in a mortar, and you'll get a very fancy one like this. A little bottle like this would be about $30. That's how much difference it is in terms of making the olive oil. Now, the light of the 7 lamps on the lampstand represented the Lord's presence, his light within the inner court. The priests were required to keep the lamps burning continually. Remember that word's repeated 3 times, to acknowledge the Lord's constant presence and to show their willingness to continually serve him. So the emphasis here is the lights continually burn because the Lord is continually present. And the priests are continually servicing the lampstand, representing their continuing service of the Lord. Now we're going to go to the second item that we're going to talk about that's in the scripture, and that's the table of showbread. The table of showbread depicted Christ's protection of the nation of Israel during the age of the Gentiles. This all was a foretelling or a future prediction of what these represented. The table of showbread is a table of fellowship between God and Israel. After God gave his instructions to Moses about the ark and the mercy seat, which were to be placed behind the veil in the most holy place of the tabernacle, God then told Moses that he would meet with him there above the mercy seat between the 2 cherubim that were placed over the ark of the testimony. So God would meet with Moses and later the high priest on the Day of Atonement in the most holy place. But in the very next verse, after talking about God meeting Moses and later the high priest in the most holy place, God gave Moses instructions regarding the table of showbread, linking God's meeting with Moses and later with the high priest above the mercy seat to the fellowship which would take place in the inner court with the presentation and subsequent consumption or eating of the 12 loaves of bread by the priests. So you have this table of showbread, and that really represented the fellowship and the interaction between God and the priests on a continuing basis. The association or link between the ark, where God met with the high priest once a year, and the table of fellowship is further established by the fact that both the ark and the table were covered with golden crowns depicting Christ in his glorified state. And both of them had the same height of 1.5 cubits, or about 27 inches in height. So when we look at it, there's a similarity in terms of just the structure of these two things, and both had crowns. The description of the table of showbread, it similar to all the other furnishings in the tabernacle except the mercy seat, the lampstand, and the utensils. All three of those were made of pure solid gold. The showbread table was made of acacia wood overlaid with gold. And the poles were also, that were used to carry it, were also made of acacia wood overlaid with gold. Unlike all the other items of furniture except for the ark and the golden altar, the table of showbread had a gold molding or a crown around the top. Anytime there's a gold molding around the top of these furnishings, it always was a depiction of Christ with his crown. The significance that the lampstand was made of solid beaten gold and the two other items of the furniture in the holy place both had gold crowns or molding is the fact that the lampstand is Christ, the light himself, and the other one's depicting Christ reigning in the future. Attached to each of the four corners at the bottom of the table showbread were golden rings, which were used for the poles that were made of acacia wood overlaid with gold to slide into and carry the table of showbread when the tabernacle was taken down and they started to journey through the wilderness. When the table was being carried, however, the 12 loaves of bread and the utensils remained on top of the table. They were continually there. Just because they were traveling, God's fellowship with the Israelites was not taken away. Now, the purpose and significance of the table of showbread. Although the table and its poles were made of acacia wood overlaid with gold, which depicted the dual nature of Christ as both man and God, the crown depicted Christ after his resurrection and ascension to heaven. The table of showbread was positioned on the north side of the inner court. So as you're entering, it'd be on the right side, opposite where the lampstand was. This was considered the darker part of the inner court. The darkness part, lit by the candle stand on the other side, reflected the darkness of Israel for rejecting the Messiah, and that the light of Christ still shines on them, but it did not have its own source of light at the time. The 12 loaves of showbread signified the 12 tribes of Israel. I don't think it's too difficult to make that association. The loaves of showbread were each made of 2 omers of fine flour, wheat, 2 representing a double portion. The loaves were all pierced. The 12 loaves of unleavened bread were placed on the table on each Sabbath day and remained there for 7 days. And then when the new loaves of bread were placed on the table the next Sabbath, the priests used the plates, utensils, and cups to eat the 12 old loaves of bread, signifying their fellowship with God and their communion in the presence of God. So every week they exchanged the 12 loaves, consuming the old loaves and replacing them with the new loaves. Both the table, which had molding covering of golden crown, and the bread, which was pierced, signified Christ in his glorified position, providing for and sustaining the 12 tribes of Israel during the age of the Gentiles, which is a period of time Israel will remain in darkness because of their rejection of Jesus as their Messiah. Now, obviously, the Israelites didn't appreciate all these things back at the time that they're in the most holy place or the holy place doing their ceremonies. But in the New Testament and Paul and in Hebrews, when they talk and they look back to this tabernacle, the significance and the pointing towards Christ becomes abundantly clear. God's instruction for the bread of the presence to remain before him at all times signifies God's continuing presence. The rim or edge around the top of the table, which was a handbreadth in height, signified Christ's protection of and his fellowship with the nation of Israel. Just because Israel is presently scattered throughout the world doesn't mean that they still aren't receiving God's protection, especially the remnant or the blessings that are going to flow to Israel in the future. Israel is having a tough ride during the period of the Gentiles, with all the times that they suffered under the Gentile kingdoms that have attempted to destroy the Jewish people. But God has always preserved a remnant a remnant that will be there during the days of tribulation, and a remnant that will be restored to the nation of Israel in the promised land. Now, verses 5 through 9 of Leviticus, chapter 24, describes the flour and the process for making the showbread. The scriptures say, take fine flour and bake it into 12 loaves. Each loaf is to be made with 4 quarts. Arrange them into rows, 6 to a row, on the pure gold table before the Lord. Place pure frankincense near each row, so that it may serve as a memorial proportion for the bread and a fire offering to the Lord. The bread is to be set out before the Lord every Sabbath day as a perpetual covenant obligation on the part of the Israelites. It belongs to Aaron and his sons, who are to eat it in a holy place, for it is the holiest portion for him from the fire offerings to the Lord. This is a permanent rule. So here we have added to all what we previously learned about the table of showbread is that God is reminding the Israelites that this showbread, the 12 tribes, and its position on the table of showbread and its fellowship by the priest consuming it, all represented the God's covenant relationship with Israel and how that covenant continues. And frankly, it's just like saying, as long as the bread sits on the table of showbread, Israel will remain in its covenant relationship with God. And you can see in Israel's history how many times the temple stopped exercising all these rituals. Hezekiah had to reopen the temple and read the word of God. The temple was destroyed for a period of time. It was during these periods of time that the covenant relationship with God was broken. So you can see, you could really go through the Old Testament and see how this bread and the represented the 12 tribes in their covenant relationship with God. And it was also called or referred to as the bread of presence, the presence of God with his people. Now, by placing the newly baked bread, unleavened bread on the presence on the table each Sabbath, the Israelites were acknowledged their continual presence of the Lord and their continuing willingness to serve them. The Hebrew word for loaves, challah, refers to flat, unleavened loaves baked in an oven. This surprised me. Each loaf weighed at least 5.5 pounds. That's a heavy, I've had hardtack in the Army, but I never had 5 pounds of hardtack. That would be too much for me to carry in my rucksack. The frankincense placed next to the 2 stacks of bread was considered a memorial portion, whereby the Israelites were asking the Lord to favorably remember his covenant with them. If you remember, when we studied the sacrifices, there was a memorial portion which was put on the altar and burned, and that was to remind God of the covenant relationship and to ask God for favor. And people would take the frankincense with bread and put it on with the other sacrifices on the brazen altar. And this was basically a way of saying to God, please grant my request and show me favor in what I'm sacrificing to you. Now, the symbolism in keeping the lamps lit and keeping the fresh bread on the table. The continual actions of the priest to keep the lamps lit and to keep bread on the table in the inner court acknowledged the Lord's continual presence among them. So this was something they did on a daily basis. And by doing so, it was to remind them by a physical act that God was present with them. Their continual actions also demonstrated their commitment to continually serve God. They had to put more oil into the calyxes for the lampstand. They had to replace the showbread. All of this were acts to show continuing service to the Lord. By using the purest ingredients for the oil, the flour, and the frankincense, they were really honoring the Lord as King. The best is for the King. By placing fresh bread before the Lord every Sabbath, they reaffirmed their covenant commitment to the Lord and their continuing request and dependence on the Lord's covenant blessings and favor. The continuing actions of the priest symbolically maintain the sanctity of the covenant relationship between God and the Israelites. God commanded them to do this as a reminder of their covenant relationship. Their acts of continuing to do this was really a way of maintaining the sanctity or the holiness of their covenant relationship as holy people belonging to God. So that's a lot to say at the first part of this chapter, but again, I ask the question. We just got through with the redemptive feasts, and what happens? We start the first part of chapter 24 with what? Oil and flour and the inner court. So now, following the tradition of chapter 24 of Leviticus, we jump to a completely, apparently unrelated subject. We're going to talk about maintaining the sanctity of God's holy name. It starts out with an incident relating to blasphemy of the Lord's name. Verses 10 through 16 of Leviticus chapter 24 tells us about an incident which occurred in the Israelite camp. Now, the son of an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father was among the Israelites. A fight broke out in the camp between the Israelite woman's son and the Israelite man. Her son cursed and blasphemed the name, that's the name of God, and they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shemoleth, a daughter of Debri of the tribe of Dan. They put him in custody until the Lord's decision could be made clear to them. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, "Bring the one who is cursed to the outside of the camp, and have all who heard him lay their hands on his head, then have the whole community stone him. And tell the Israelites, if anyone curses his God, he will bear the consequences of his sin. Whoever blasphemes the name of Yahweh is to be put to death. The whole community must stone him. If he blasphemes the name, he is to be put to death, whether the foreign resident or the native." The reason that they took him aside and held him in custody is this person that blasphemed the Lord was a half-breed. He was a foreigner. He had an Egyptian father and an Israelite mother. Some scholars opine, but I can't find any scriptural base, that the Egyptian father stayed in Egypt and the mother brought the son. And being not a real Israelite or 100% Israelite, he was treated as an alien or a foreigner. He probably didn't get along very well with the rest of the Israelites. And like many mixed marriages, they have the problem of how much their faith or allegiance is to the family of God versus their Egyptian ways. But one thing is clear from this incident that occurred. Cursing the name of the Lord or using the Lord's name in a curse is blasphemy. Blasphemy is an egregious offense against the Lord. Using the Lord's name in a curse not only disrespects the name of the Lord, but it shows utter contempt for and rejection of the Lord as king. The name of the Lord represents the person of the Lord. To blaspheme the Lord's name was to blaspheme the Lord himself. It very clear in the culture of that day, the name identified the person. The name of God identified who God was. It represented his holy character, his holy essence, his holy nature. And even though I say blasphemy diminishes the holiness of God, God is never diminished by the sin of man. But what it does is it diminishes the holiness of God in the eyes of the people that are supposed to worship and respect him. And so it becomes a defilement, just like any other impurity that happens in the camp. Now, I mentioned that the offender was the son of a mixed relationship, and he was treated as a foreigner. But they had to, because he was not a true 100% Israelite, they really didn't know whether the laws dealing with blasphemy covered him and that he would be stoned to death. The Lord made it very clear to Moses that it didn't matter whether he's a foreigner or not. If he's among God's people and he blasphemes the name of the Lord, then he deserves the penalty of death. It's a capital offense. And because it defiled the camp, the offender was taken outside the camp, where his sin was laid upon his head by the witnesses, and then he was executed by being stoned to death. The name of the Lord is holy. It reflects the holy essence and character of God. In fact, the name of the Lord was so sacred to the Israelites that they never used the name when they spoke about the Lord. And when the Lord's name was written, it was written with just capital letters YHWH. And even today, there remains a debate or a question as to the pronunciation of these letters. Some of them insert the vowels, it comes out Jehovah. Other ones, Yahweh, spelled either with a J or a Y. This name was so holy to the Israelite people that when the Essenes were copying the Old Testament scriptures, whenever they came across the name of God in the scriptures, they stopped their transcription and they symbolically cleansed themselves by taking a bath and praying before they returned to the tables to write the Lord's name in the scriptures. They did this every time they came across the name Yahweh in the scriptures. I can imagine how long it would take to transcribe if I have to do that each time. The seriousness of the crime of blaspheming the Lord's name was reflected by the death penalty imposed on the blasphemer. This incident emphasizes the importance of maintaining the sanctity of the Lord's name, which reflects God's holy essence and character. So in the first part, the sanctity of the relationship between God's people and God in their covenant relationship. And here we have the sanctity being protected of the Lord's name. Now we're going to jump to the third part of chapter 24, which jumps to something else. And the final verses of the chapter, verses 17 through 22, recognize the sanctity of human life. The scriptures read, "If a man kills anyone, he must be put to death. Whoever kills an animal is to make restitution for it, life for life. If any man inflicts a permanent injury on his neighbor, whatever he has done is to be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he inflicted on the person, the same is to be inflicted on him. Whoever kills an animal is to make restitution for it. But whoever kills a person is to be put to death. You are to have the same law for foreign resident and native, because I am Yahweh your God." Now, these verses distinguish between crimes against humans and crimes against property. Crimes against humans were considered far more serious than crimes against property. Murder was a capital offense, while crimes against property were never considered as capital offenses or death penalty offenses. Capital punishment for the murder or taking of a human life reflected the sacredness, the sanctity of life itself. No one could take a life of a human being without surrendering his own life. Crimes against property required restitution in the form of replacement of the property or monetary damages equal to the value of the property. Now, we're going to go into a little detail about this eye for an eye. Really what we're talking about, a lot of people understand an eye for an eye, meaning total vengeance for total vengeance. But really what it means is that the penalties for the crimes against humans were proportionate to the crime committed. The penalty must fit the crime. This principle was later incorporated into Roman law, which was referred to as the lex talionis, which is something that was carried into civil law in the France and into our law in our country for proportionate penalties for crimes. The law of an eye for an eye was a law of proportionality, which restrained the scope of revenge or recompense which would otherwise exist in pagan societies. In pagan societies, it really became the Hatfields versus the McCoys. The tit for tat just got worse and worse until it was total vengeance for even the smallest of offenses. And so this God is a God of justice. And what he said is that the penalty for whatever offense to a human being has to fit the crime. So if the harm was done to a person resulted in an injury to their eye, then the person that caused that injury would have the same type of injury to his eye. Or if it was a death or a killing of a human being, then the same penalty was death for the person that committed the murder. So it ensured that there was not excessive punishment for the crime that was committed. However, it remained that if the damage was to property, then restitution in the form of replacement of the item of property or monetary damages, if that's not possible, had to be exchanged. Now, the last part of this type of justice that the Lord pronounced in these scriptures is not only did the penalty have to fit the crime, it applied equally to everyone. The law was applied to native citizens and to aliens, to rich as well as poor, and to slaves and to free persons alike. It didn't matter your status. If a wealthy man committed an offense and it caused a poor person or another Israelite to lose their eye, then the wealthy person would lose his eye. Everybody was treated equally. The only exception to that, if you remember when we studied, a master who injured his servant was required to let his servant go free. And so there wasn't proportionality or equal penalty imposed upon a master to a slave. If you remember, the master owned the slave. So if he injured the slave, then he had to let the slave go free. This equal application of the law reflected the biblical principle that all humans are created in God's image and made no distinction between the social status, wealth, or citizenship of those who committed the offenses and those who were victims of the events. So what we have here is the sanctity of life. And God created man in his image, and he expected man to be dispensing justice equally. So we have really three different parts of this bizarre chapter. We have the part that deals with the oil and the bread for the service in the inner sanctuary of the tabernacle. And then we have the incident of blasphemy of the God's name. And then we have this principle of not being imposing excessive penalty, and that murder of a human being is a capital offense. The common theme that I gleaned out of all three of them is this word sanctity. The sanctity of the covenant relationship between Israel and God that was kept alive and maintained by the priests providing the oil on a daily basis to light the lampstand and providing the bread on a weekly basis to have fellowship and communion with God. It was a continued recognition of this holy relationship between the people of God, Israel, and their Lord. The middle part, when we talk about the Lord's name, our Lord is a holy God. His name represents his holiness. And so it was talking about the sanctity of God's holiness and maintaining that sanctity in terms of his name and his holy character. And then we get the sanctity of life that's recognized in the law dealing with punishment, eye for an eye, that it's not excessive punishment, the punishment fits the crime, and that property is dealt differently than human life. So that's a common theme that I glean out of it. And I'll tell you, it took a lot of prayer and finally God answering it to bring it all together that way. But I really think it applies. So our lesson tonight, you know, if you have a car and you don't drive it, you don't change the oil, you don't take care of it, pretty soon the car doesn't work. Our relationship with God requires continuing maintenance. It requires our attention. And God is a God that wants us to daily have a relationship with him in prayer, in study, in thought, in deed. And so a lot of the things we're talking about tonight is all part of our maintenance of the sanctity of our relationship with God. And so if that point gets across tonight, I think that we've made a step